It's my pleasure to introduce to you Thomas Baldwin. You probably know him much better than I do. We just have met for the first time, but I knew him as the editor of essays by Merleau-Ponty and on Merleau-Ponty, and as the editor of Minds. I also see that he has slightly changed the title of his talk, which is now Merleau-Ponty's Phenomenology Critique of Natural Science.
Well, thank you very much, Rudolf. Okay, let me just say a little about why I changed the title. Perhaps also explains, perhaps even excuses the slightly chaotic nature of my talk. I started thinking that I would like to talk about Merleau-Ponty's reflections on nature all the way through his work, from the structure of behavior up to the lectures that have been published recently, and maybe on into the visible and the invisible. But as I went on with this, it seemed to me completely impossible. Partly too much to accommodate within a talk for this audience at this time, and partly anyway because my sense that Merleau-Ponty, in a sense, had a gestalt about where he was aiming and what he was trying to demonstrate or suggest rather evaporated, particularly when I was reading the lectures. So I thought instead it was better to focus on something that was targeted fairly directly on the theme of the conference, and I think actually that decision was a suitable one. Instead, I wanted to focus then precisely on what the new title addresses, the attempt at a critique of natural science, which it sort of hadn't quite struck me before, is actually, in a sense, the central theme of his main work, Phenomenology of Perception. So my talk will be exclusively concerned with Phenomenology of Perception. Maybe he would want to change some of the things he says, some of the things I go on to criticize in his later writings, but we can talk about that later. Okay. Now, I'm conscious that although many of you will be over-familiar with Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology, some of you may have rather limited familiarity with it. So I've put some chunks of text on PowerPoint. I don't think I'll read them all out, because if I did, I think I'd run out of time, but I will sort of skim through some of them fairly briskly. Okay, so in the preface to the Phenomenology, Merleau-Ponty writes, and I will run through this a bit, he says, if we want to subject science itself to rigorous scrutiny and arrive at a precise assessment of its meaning and scope, we must begin by reawakening the basic experience of the world, of which science is the secondary expression. Science has not and never will have, by its nature, the same significance qua form of being as the perceived world, for the simple reason that it is a determination or explanation of that world. I am the absolute source. My existence does not stem from my antecedents, from my social and physical environment. Instead, it moves out towards them and sustains them. For I alone bring into being for myself, and therefore into being in the only sense that that word can have for me, the tradition which I elect to carry on. Scientific points of view, according to which my existence is a moment of the world's, are always both naive and at the same time dishonest, because they take for granted, without explicitly mentioning it, the other point of view, namely that of consciousness, through which from the outset a world forms around me and begins to exist for me. To return to things themselves is to return to that world which precedes knowledge, of which knowledge always speaks, and in relation to which every scientific schematization is an abstract and derivative sign language, as is geography in relation to the countryside, in which we have learnt beforehand what a forest, a prairie, or a river is. Okay. As you can see, this is a very strong claim. So Merleau-Ponty contrasts scientific points of view as secondary and derivative with what he elsewhere calls the primacy of perception, whereby we're fundamentally at home in the unreflective perceived world, which alone gives meaning to the abstractions that are characteristic of science. And his claim here is not simply epistemological, namely that the scientific point of view draws on the non-scientific concepts that we employ in ordinary life. It's fundamentally ontological. It is that the conception of a fully objective scientific world is just misconceived. There is no such world, since in fundamental respects, for Merleau-Ponty, the world is subjective. So to talk of a scientific world is to talk only of a derivative partial characterization of a world which captures its subjective aspects, but necessarily omits those subjective aspects which escape scientific characterization and require instead the intention of the phenomenological philosopher, whose task, he puts in a rather nice way, is not the reflection of a pre-existing truth, but, like art, the act of bringing truth into being. And it's always worth bearing in mind with Merleau-Ponty that he likes to think of his work as much more like that of an artist than that of a scientist. Okay, now in thinking about this claim, we can distinguish between three responses to it. First, that one could fully accept the claim, except that Merleau-Ponty shows that the natural sciences provide at best explanations of certain partial aspects of the world, but cannot provide a fundamental understanding of the world. Okay? A variation of this response would be to hold that Merleau-Ponty is broadly right, but doesn't provide good reasons for that position. Okay, I'm not going to address that. Second response might be a kind of qualified acceptance. One can reject Merleau-Ponty's reasons for holding that natural science cannot provide a fundamental understanding of the natural world, but still accept his reasons for thinking that there are aspects of human life that are in principle beyond the scope of natural science, since they can't be captured in objective terms and require instead creative insights comparable to those of art. Okay, now this I think is quite a commonly held view, but it does lead to a form of dualism, both methodological and ontological, and dualisms are notoriously unstable. The third response, of course, is going to be qualified rejection. It's going to be the view that Merleau-Ponty's arguments don't establish even the in-principle thesis of the second response, the B thesis. Instead, what they do is they lay down a challenge to scientific approaches to human life, which invite a rethinking of some of the assumptions that guide scientific inquiry, perhaps, say, the thesis that David mentioned, namely the causal closure of physics. Maybe they invite us to engage in emergentist approaches to the causation of human affairs, but they don't spell that out, certainly. Now, my own tentative conclusion, the position for which I'll be arguing, is in fact a hybrid of the second and third positions, in that I think that there is a kind of dualism, a nature-culture dualism, which is slightly to one side from Merleau-Ponty's arguments, which therefore informs a part of the second response. But I want to emphasize that in rejecting Merleau-Ponty's position, I don't want to imply that it's not interesting and not worthy of discussion. Okay, let me now just fill in one or two background points about where Merleau-Ponty's coming from. Okay, so his major works are all done between roughly 1940 and 1960, in other words, 70 to 50 years ago. So well before the development, say, of DNA-based genetics, well before the familiarity with computers, which forms the background to AI, to computational models of the mind and contemporary neuroscience. When Merleau-Ponty discusses space and time, he does occasionally allude to the great work of the early 20th century physicists. But I regret to say his comments about, say, Einstein are not well judged. And even on biology, he seems, insofar as he alludes to it at all, to be remarkably ill-informed about the implications of Darwinian theory. What about history and philosophy of science? given the strong claim that Merleau-Ponty makes, his references in these areas are, let's say, disappointing. He alludes occasionally to Coiré and to Bachelard, but he never alludes to Meyerson, who I think of as a great philosopher of science. He never alludes to Pierre Duhem. That's very striking. He refers quite a lot to Leon Brunswick, who I take to have been one of his teachers at the École Normale, who was a good French neo-Kantian philosopher, roughly comparable to James Ward, who was Russell's teacher and was a sort of British neo-Kantian who was well acquainted with developments in physics. What's also disappointing, I'm afraid, in Merleau-Ponty's writings are the very dismissive comments about logical positivism. He clearly made no attempt at all to understand and discuss the core Vienna Circle project of characterizing what Dermot was mentioning, the scientific world conception. Now why? Why did he never do this? Well, perhaps it was the sort of formal logic that, just the mere symbolism on the printed page that he found rebarbative. I don't know. There was some clearly block there. But it is very surprising because it's well attested that at the end of the Second World War, Merleau-Ponty became quite good friends with Freddy Ayer, who came over to Paris quite often to enjoy the left bank and the jazz scene and everything. And Ayer at one time tried quite hard to get Merleau-Ponty to join the department at UCL that he was setting up. And there's a sort of historical possibility that is, striking, disappointing. Merleau-Ponty eventually decided he didn't want to come. Okay. Now, Merleau-Ponty's arguments in the Phenomenology run through 4 stages. Okay, there's an introduction, which includes a critique of attempts to provide a scientific understanding of perception and a sketch of Merleau-Ponty's alternative. In part 1, he talks about the body, criticizes attempts to provide a scientific understanding of broadly the human body, especially human behavior, and an alternative account of his own, in which something that he calls the phenomenal body emerges as a subject of the perceived world. Then in part 2, there's a discussion of the perceived world, which includes a critique of scientific treatments of space and of motion, and in which Merleau-Ponty sketches an alternative in which objective space is conceived as an abstracted aspect of human spatiality, which is the structure of our subjective bodily being in the world. And then in the last part, part 3, there is a similar discussion of time. Now, I shall follow that structure in my discussion. So first, back to the introduction to the discussion of perception. Okay, so here's Merleau-Ponty's verdict, comes very early on in this introductory section. Let's just skim through this. He says, inevitably science, in its general effort towards objectification, evolved a picture of the human organism as a physical system undergoing stimuli, which were themselves identified by their physico-chemical properties, and tried to reconstitute actual perception on this basis, and close the circle of scientific knowledge by discovering the laws governing the production of knowledge itself, by establishing an objective science of subjectivity. Well, it's a pretty bold way of characterizing sort of late 19th century psychology, probably too bold. But it is inevitable, says Merleau-Ponty, this attempt should fail. If we return to the objective investigations themselves, we first of all discover that the conditions external to the sensory field do not govern it part by part, that they exert an effect only to the extent of making possible a basic pattern, which is what Gestalt theory makes clear. In the 1930s, Merleau-Ponty worked a lot on Gestalt theory. And he goes on, thus we see that within the organism the structure depends on variables such as the biological meaning of the situation, which are no longer physical variables, with the result that the whole eludes the well-known instruments of physico-mathematical analysis and opens the way to another kind of intelligibility. And if we now turn back, as is done here, towards perceptual experience, we notice that science succeeds in constructing only a semblance of subjectivity, It introduces sensations, which are things just where experience shows that there are meaningful patterns. Okay, so that's a summary of his the claims that he's going to make. Now, before going through it in any detail, and I'm not going to, Merleau-Ponty does acknowledge that what he calls the general effort towards objectification, which is characteristic of science, is itself in part motivated by perception itself. For, as he puts it, he puts it that our perception ends in objects, and the object once constituted appears as the reason for all the experiences of it which we have or could have. So he says, human life is defined of this in terms of this power which it has of denying itself in objective thought, a power which stems from its primordial attachment to the world itself. So the motivation for the kind of understanding characteristic of objective natural science is internal, says Merleau-Ponty, to perception itself. But Merleau-Ponty holds this motivation is misguided. Once we manage to suspend this natural attitude that's characteristic of perception and stand back in phenomenological reflection, we come to see that perception has a kind of meaningful subjectivity that cannot be encompassed within the objective framework of natural science. Okay, well, why not? Well, this passage and the preceding one, I think I won't keep them up all the time, or flip between them. Why not? What's the reasons that he has? In a way, the line of thought has three parts, I think. One is he takes it, a scientific approach has to rely on what he calls atomic sensations, which are conceived of as elements of perceptual states. On this view, he says, as he puts it, perception is built up with states of consciousness as a house is built of bricks, and a mental chemistry is invoked to fuse these materials into a compact whole. That's a view, he says, that Gestalt theory has shown to be completely mistaken. Second point, the Gestalt theory itself indicates that forms enter into our perceptions in a way which can't be understood unless we recognize that they provide the meaningful structure to an experience which enables it to be a way of making sense of things. So Gestalt phenomena can't be assimilated by objective thought because one phenomenon releases another not by means of some efficient cause like those which link together natural events, but by the meaning which it holds out. So the thought is that Gestalt theory builds or has to make or draws on some meaningful association or connection between experiences which stands outside the domain of objective science. Okay, are these considerations persuasive? And there's quite a lot of them in the text. And it seems to me that they should not persuade us. I mean, as far as I know, we still lack a completely satisfactory account of sensory, but the atomism Merleau-Ponty criticizes has long gone from psychology. Just think of J.J. Gibson's work about nearly 50 years ago now on sensory systems. And once one bears in mind the evolutionary merits one would expect to find built into sensory systems, it's just a matter of course that they should deliver perceptions that make some sense, some meaningful sense of the perceived environment. So while Merleau-Ponty certainly identifies here plausible requirements on a tenable sensory psychology, once one appreciates the computational resources available in the brain and the potential role of evolution in programming these resources, it's hard to see why an objective sensory neuroscience should not be able to accommodate Gestalt theory and the kind of meaningful understanding that it indicates perception provides. But there are two further points in Merleau-Ponty's discussion which merit brief attention. First, he emphasizes what he calls the normativity of perception. And the characteristic case he says he gives is this. For each object, for each picture in an art gallery, there's an optimum distance from which it requires to be seen, a direction viewed from which it vouchsafes most of itself. Now, one might suggest that since the objectivity of natural science is supposed to preclude normativity, this normativity inherent in perception reveals an aspect that transcends scientific explanation. But in fact, Merleau-Ponty himself connects this normativity with our capacity for recognizing the things that we perceive. He says, this normativity, this general direction in space, is not a contingent characteristic. Instead, it's the means whereby I recognize the object and I'm conscious of it. So once we take it that a capacity for recognition is one of the proper functions of a perceptual system, it's not surprising that the conditions under which this function is best fulfilled with respect to objects become favored as the optimum conditions for perceiving objects of that type. So the normativity of perception falls out of the kind of functional characterization of perceptual systems which an evolutionary approach would lead one to expect. Second further point concerns the perceived world and what's available in the perceived world. Merleau-Ponty writes, once more seeking a definition of what we perceive through the physical and chemical properties of the stimuli which may act upon our sensory apparatus. Empiricism, we can call it scientific naturalism, excludes from perception the anger or the pain I nevertheless read in a face, the religion whose essence I seize in some hesitation or reticence, the city whose temper I recognize in the attitude of a policeman, or the style of a public building. Now, there clearly is a serious point here. If a scientific account of perception came with a reductive program according to which the contents of perception were somehow to be accounted for by reference merely to the physical and chemical properties of the subject situation, the resulting position would be very difficult to believe, given the richness of our conceptual systems with all their thick historical, personal, and theoretical references. But that issue does not strike me as central to perception itself so much as to our understanding of language, history, value, and all the rest. And I think we can legitimately set aside the issue of accommodating all of that alongside a broadly scientific understanding of ourselves while discussing perception per se. If one holds, as I do, that the hermeneutic structure of these aspects of our lives does make them different in kind from natural phenomena, then to that extent there will be a central aspect of our lives, and thereby of perceptual content, which transcends objective natural science. But this thought, while clearly enough affirmed by Merleau-Ponty, is not central to his arguments. This passage comes very briefly at the end of one chapter and is never taken up again. This line of thought is a claim whose warrant is not to be found in phenomenological investigations, but instead belongs with the hermeneutic neo-Kantian tradition that particularly is to be found in the works of Rickert, as Dermot mentioned. What's central to Merleau-Ponty's position is a different theme, implicit in the points made earlier, but which becomes progressively central to his argument, namely that perception is fundamentally a way of bodily being in the world, and that the world which thus specifies the content of perception is not objective because of its dependence upon a kind of embodied subjectivity. Now, Merleau-Ponty's way of addressing this bold claim, which is the central theme of the book, is actually slightly oblique. He begins by taking the case of the body and arguing that when we understand properly the nature of our own embodiment, we will see that objective natural science does not provide a satisfactory account of it, and that what we require instead is an existential analysis which gives weight to subjective perspectives that can't be accommodated within a broader objective point of view. Now, Merleau-Ponty initially introduces attention to this case of the body because he thinks it's a paradigmatic case in which the scientific approach breaks down. Oh, sorry, that's got out of place. Something must be... yeah, that's it, sorry. I must have pressed the wrong thing. Okay, so let's consider then objective thought at work in the constitution of our body as object, since this is a crucial moment in the genesis of the objective world. And it will be seen that one's own body evades, even within science itself, the treatment to which it's intended to subject it. However, as he goes on to say, the case of the body is not just paradigmatic, it also has a foundational role. Since, he says, the genesis of the objective body is only a moment in the constitution of the object, the body, by withdrawing from the objective world, will carry with it the intentional threads linking it to its surrounding, and finally reveal to us the perceiving subject and also the perceived world. So we must ask, why does one's own body evade, even within science, the treatment to which it's intended to subject it? Why should we come to treat the objective body as, just as he puts it, an impoverished image of the body we live by, what he calls the phenomenal body, which is not really an object at all, but just a way of conceiving of our own embodiment? MerleauPontys' argument basically rests on two cases in which he holds objective considerations lack the resources to deal with the bodily situation, and in which we need to introduce instead an existential perspective which draws essentially on the subject's experience and way of engaging with the situation. Okay, these cases will be familiar to anyone who's engaged at all with Merleau-Ponty. One concerns the phantom limb situation of amputees, the second that of the disability suffered by a patient with a brain injury, Schneider, whose case was studied and written up in detail by the psychologists Gelb and Goldstein. So let's just look quickly at these cases. First, in the case of phantom limb. The discussion of a phantom limb occurs in the context of a discussion of the body image and the body schema, which Merleau-Ponty takes to be central for our capacity for organized behavior. And this indeed seems right and straightforwardly compatible with a scientific account of motor skills and bodily movement. But what's special about the case of the phantom limb is the failure of the agent to adapt his body schema to his new situation, so that he's liable, the leg amputee is liable to get up and set off walking as if he still had the amputated leg and then fall over. And equally, the persistence of a hazy sense of the persisting existence of the amputated limb remains in the agent's background body image. Now, for Merleau-Ponty, this failure is really only understandable in existential terms as a repressed memory of life in an undamaged condition, which persists as an unconscious refusal to accept mutilation, as he puts it. Yet, although one can readily see why amputation brings with it the emotional affect that Merleau-Ponty introduces here, it's also easy enough to see why the agent's subpersonal bodily systems are likely to retain well-entrenched aspects of the body schema and the body image. And indeed, this can be very beneficial. Oliver Sacks remarks that their persistence is invaluable for an amputee who is learning to use a prosthetic limb. It makes it very much easier for the agent to incorporate the prosthetic limb into their body schema if it occupies the place in the body image that has been preserved by the phantom limb. So it seems to me hard to see that the phantom limb phenomenon is a clear counterexample to a scientific conception of the body and of our embodiment. Merleau-Ponty includes in his discussion of this case further points about repression and what he calls the ebb and flow of personal life, which are sensitive and which do capture important aspects of our lives. But from them alone, there is no challenge to a scientific approach to the body. Okay, what about Schneider? The issue posed here is that of connecting his unusual disability, his incapacity for what's called abstract movement, with the brain injury that he suffered in the First World War. Now, Merleau-Ponty's claim is very simply that this connection cannot be identified if one concentrates only on the neurophysiological damage and indeed on the functional problems, such as the damage to Schneider's visual system. Instead, the ground for Schneider's problem can only be diagnosed if one places the situation in the context of a fundamental aspect of our capacity for action, namely what Merleau-Ponty calls our basic motor intentionality, which informs our movements with a sense of the past, the future, the possible, the sensible, and so on. And it's a diminution of this capacity which best explains Schneider's multiple handicaps. So here is Merleau-Ponty's quite well-known presentation of this thesis. Let us therefore say, borrowing a term from other works, that the life of consciousness, cognitive life, the life of desire or perceptual life, is subtended by an intentional arc, which projects around about us our past, our future, our human setting, our physical, ideological, and moral situation, or rather, which results in our being situated in all these respects. And it's this intentional arc which brings about the unity of the senses of intelligence, sensibility, and motility, and it's this which goes limp in illness, particularly in Schneider's case. Now, this passage captures a core theme of Merleau-Ponty's book, and it's a theme with which I have no great quarrel, except perhaps that Merleau-Ponty slightly overstates his claim by talking about ideological and moral situation. But what remains to be clarified are the grounds for the morals Merleau-Ponty seeks to draw from this case, namely that our motor skills normally draw on a kind of bodily intentionality which is not accessible from within the objective standpoint of a scientific approach. For why should this motor intentionality not be a capacity grounded in the subpersonal cognitive systems which are developed and sustained by the agent's neural centers? After all, it is a brain injury which has led to Schneider's incapacity, as Merleau-Ponty himself emphasizes. Now, so far as I can tell, Merleau-Ponty has just two lines of thought to support his position here. One concerns scientific methodology. In the only place in the book in which he does actually discuss this, he argues that while there are never crucial experiments in science, the implications of apparent counterexamples are managed in different ways in physics and physiology and psychology. In physics, different hypotheses which offer different specific solutions to the problem posed by a counterexample can be ranked in terms of their relative probability. But in psychology, this is not possible because of the holistic aspect of psychological problems. Hence, a scientific approach which offers specific hypotheses, such as kind of neural damage, he thinks is never going to be satisfactory as an account of Schneider's handicaps. We need to find a much more all-embracing diagnosis, and this is one which, as he puts it, signals the failure of the inductive method or of causal thinking in the realm of psychology. Now, this line of argument really should not strike us as persuasive. Post-Kuhn, we are all familiar with the way in which a succession of anomalies can lead to a crisis in an area of natural science whose solution requires not piecemeal revision of normal science, but the kind of all-embracing gestalt shift Merleau-Ponty seeks to identify as uniquely characteristic of psychology rather than physics. And within psychology and medicine, there's plenty of scope for piecemeal revisions of normal science as new research identifies and refines distinctions. So the burden of argument for Merleau-Ponty's anti-naturalist claim has to be carried by another line of thought. And he does have another one, which is that objective natural science cannot accommodate the standpoint of the bodily intentionality revealed by the diagnosis of Schneider's disabilities. Well, is this persuasive? There's obviously no difficulty in incorporating different subjective perspectives, visual perspectives, within an objective framework. And functional accounts of some forms of intentional representation are unproblematic and should be applicable to the subpersonal systems that constitute the bodily intentionality Merleau-Ponty is concerned with. Well, what is it that Merleau-Ponty has in mind? There's a phrase that he uses in stating his conclusion, down the bottom there, which is perhaps revealing. Bodily experience, he says, forces us to acknowledge an imposition of meaning which is not the work of a universal constituting consciousness. Now, the universal constitution consciousness, that's the Kantian or neo-Kantian idealism Merleau-Ponty rejects. Okay. But he wants to put in its place something bodily, but something which has some kind of constituting or imposing role. So the thought here is that if one goes down this line of thought, it does turn out to have the anti-objectivist implication that he draws. since truths which are imposed or constituted by subjective standpoints are not going to be amenable to an accommodation within an objective natural science. Well, the question now is, does the diagnosis of Schneider's case by itself warrant the talk of imposition of meaning? I think not. It must be found elsewhere. And speaking now dogmatically myself, I don't think we find it in part one of the Phenomenology. Instead, we have to now move to part two. To part two, to the discussion of the perceived world. And my claim now is going to be that Merleau-Ponty certainly does present further considerations which have the implications that he wants. But on examination, these claims turn out either to lack support or, in two basic cases, to be misguided. Now, to set things up, let me now sketch a little brisk argument. So science is the attempt to provide objective knowledge of things. Objective considerations cannot accommodate subjectivity. There are fundamental aspects of the world which are inherently subjective. Those are the three premises of the argument. Conclusion: science can't accommodate these fundamental aspects of the world. That seems to me the core argument that we find repeated throughout the Phenomenology. Now, does it work? Well, much depends on the second premise there. There's no problem about subjectivity understood as indexicality. That's a very limited interpretation of subjectivity, however. An alternative interpretation would take us in the direction of Qualia and Jackson's knowledge argument, but let's not go there. It's plainly not central to Merleau-Ponty's thought. Indeed, he would be critical of the conception of Qualia employed in that argument. Instead, going back to the previous discussion, what seems central to his argument is an interpretation of subjectivity which makes premise C, the third premise, true. One interpretation would be, say, one which invoked a universal constituting consciousness, but we know that Merleau-Ponty rejects that kind of idealism. However, it seems that he wants to assign a somewhat similar role to the body, understood not as the objective body of science, but as the phenomenal body, which is, as he puts it, a natural self, and, as it were, the subject of perception. So, he says, we must rediscover, as anterior to the ideas of subject and object, the fact of my subjectivity, and the nascent object, that primordial layer at which both things and ideas come into being. Now, the issue for us is whether he gives good reasons for this claim, for thinking that there is a layer at which things come into being. Now, we know what this layer is going to be. It's going to be our prepersonal, anonymous, essentially embodied perceptual consciousness. And there's no reason for us to doubt that some such subpersonal layer of consciousness does inform our lives. What remains to be considered, however, is whether it's right to hold that it's in this layer that, in some sense, things come into being. Now, as I read Merleau-Ponty, there are he gives two reasons for this in part two, one concerning the limits of understanding, the other concerning space, and then in part three, he brings in a further line of thought concerning time. Okay, I'll go through these. I'll have to go a bit fast since I see time is moving on, if I'm allowed to say that. Okay, the limits of understanding first. When he's discussing space at one point, Merleau-Ponty lays out the dependence of things on the conditions under which they're perceptible. He says, every conceivable being is related either directly or indirectly to the perceived world. And since the perceived world is grasped only in terms of direction, we cannot dissociate being from oriented being, and there is no occasion to find a basis for space, or ask, what is the level of all levels? Okay, now we see here the thesis that oriented space is fundamental, and I'll come back to that, not the kind of objective space which might be a space of all spaces. But what I want to pursue first is the opening claim concerning every conceivable being. Now, its basis lies in Merleau-Ponty's use of something that's in a way quite attractive, what I could think of as the dialogue model of perception. And here's rather a long passage, I'm going to go through it. He says, the relation between things or aspects of things, having always our body as their vehicle, the whole of nature is a setting of our own life, or our interlocutor in a sort of dialogue. And that is why, in the last analysis, we cannot conceive anything which is not perceived or perceptible. As Berkeley says, even an unexplored desert has at least one person to observe it, namely myself when I think of it, that is, when I perceive it in purely mental experience. The thing is inseparable from a person perceiving it, and can never be actually in itself, because its articulations are those of our very existence, and because it stands at the other end of our gaze, or at the terminus of a sensory exploration which invests it with humanity. To this extent, every perception is a communication or a communion, the taking up or completion by us of some extraneous intention, or, on the other hand, the complete expression outside ourselves of our perceptual powers and coition, so to speak, of our body with things. Okay, now this is a really remarkable passage in which Merleau-Ponty's endorsement of Berkeley's thesis that essayist percipi is surprising and perhaps not altogether seriously affirmed. But what Merleau-Ponty does make clear here is the way in which he uses the dialogue model of perceptual inquiry, not simply to suggest a kind of question-answer for framework for perception, such as, again, as one finds, say, in the late Richard Gregory's famous works on vision, but instead to suggest the exercise of he wants to suggest that our exercise of perceptual powers is constitutive of the things perceived. So communication becomes communion. And the result is then that the perceived world is inherently subjective. And one way in this subjectivity is then manifest is in Merleau-Ponty's insistence on limits to that which is conceivable, which is simply not going to be compatible with natural science. So at the end of the book, he writes, "Nothing will ever bring home to my comprehension what a nebula that no one sees could possibly be." Now, by the standard of most contemporary cosmology, by this standard, most contemporary cosmology would be incomprehensible to Merleau-Ponty. Well, perhaps he didn't need to back himself into this untenable skepticism. But if one looks back at the long passage we looked at just now, one finds that the key thought, that perception is in part constitutive of the perceived world, instead of just a way of being open to it, stands without any argument. The dialogue model of perceptual inquiry is, I think, attractive, but Merleau-Ponty shifts from communication to communion to coition, and that shift is simply not warranted by the model. Okay, so that's one line of thought. Now, space, quickly. Right. We had that passage before. That tells us, that gives us something of the flavor of his position. We cannot dissociate being from oriented being. And a way to approach it further is via the thesis, this thesis that being, he says, is always oriented being. And he goes on to clarify this in passages like, it's of the essence of space to be always already constituted, immature, he says, and we shall never come to understand it by withdrawing to a wordless perception. Instead, as he says, my personal existence must be the resumption of a pre-personal tradition. So there's another subject beneath me for whom a world exists before I am here and who marks out my place in it. This captive or natural spirit is my body. Okay, let me move on. So space and perception generally represent at the core of the subject the perpetual contribution of his bodily being. Okay, it's a very characteristic passage. And as a way of understanding it as affirming both the primacy of oriented egocentric spatiality in our way of making sense of the world and the claim that this primacy is grounded in subpersonal embodied sensory structures. That thought I endorse, but equally it's surely wholly compatible with cognitive science and sensory psychology. But there's a further claim. Not only is this oriented space primary within our experience of the world, it is also ontologically primary, in that there is no coherent conception of an autonomous objective space within which things are located without reference to any implicit subject. Now, one line of argument for that is the Berkeleyan argument that I've looked at before. But there is another one in which, by means of which Merleau-Ponty claims to exhibit the difficulties of realism, as he calls them, with respect to motion, and thus, by implication, with respect to space. What is the argument? It is just Xenos' arrow paradox, namely that if we think of space and time as determinate distances which can be fully occupied by an arrow at an instant, then we will not be able to conceive how it is that an arrow can move at all, since at each instant it just occupies one determinate region of space. Merleau-Ponty endorses this argument, which he attributes to a character who he calls the logician, but he thinks there's a way out, namely to reject the logician's assumptions concerning objective space and time, and instead think of movement as fundamentally change of location within oriented space, which takes place during a non-instantaneous present that retains a past and anticipates a future. So here's the conclusion. The logician would have nothing to conceive, not even an appearance of movement, if there were not a movement anterior to the objective world, which is the source of all our assertions about movement. And this movement has to be understood in terms of a temporality which is not objective time made up of successive moments. It's instead a temporality constituted by the lived present, which holds a past and a future within its thickness. Okay, and here's the relativist conclusion. Okay, let's move on from this. So what are we to make of this? Well, this is, I'm afraid, just a mistake by Merleau-Ponty. Xenos' paradox, though deep, is readily resolved by allowing that there can be motion at an instant, as in Newton's theory. Now, one can pursue issues about the continuity of space and time. For example, that space and time are dense, not continuous, and then interpreting motion along a dense series. But no sensible line of thought is going to lead to Merleau-Ponty's odd subjectivist account of motion. Finally, time. Okay. The core of Merleau-Ponty's treatment of time is given in the passage quoted just now. It's objective time, which is made up of successive moments. The lived present holds a past and a future within its thickness. So, let's see in more detail now how the position unfolds. He lays out his central position, and indeed the central position, of time in his critique of objectivity in the passage that's there. The ideal of objective thought is both based upon and ruined by temporality. The world, in the full sense of the word, is not an object, for though it has an envelope of objective and determinate attributes, it also has fissures and gaps into which subjectivities slip and lodge themselves. The thing and the world exist only insofar as they are experienced by me or by subjects like me, since they are both the concatenation of our perspectives, yet they transcend all perspectives, because this chain is temporal and incomplete. Well, what's unsatisfactory about the objective conception of time? Here's Merleau-Ponty. If we separate the objective world from the finite perspectives which open upon it and posit it in itself, we find everywhere in it only so many instances of now. And these instances of now, moreover, not being present to anybody, have no temporal character and could not occur in sequence. Well, clearly much is being assumed here, and one assumption concerns the conditions for the possibility of temporal sequence. And Merleau-Ponty is completely, his view about this is clear and unequivocal. Yes, that's right. Sorry, it's this one. When I say that the day before yesterday the glacier produced water which is passing at the moment, I am tacitly assuming the existence of a witness tied to a certain spot in the world, and I am comparing his successive views. If I consider the world itself, there is simply one indivisible and changeless being in it. Change presupposes a certain position which I take up and from which I see things in procession before me. There are no events without someone to whom they happen, and from whose finite perspective is the basis of their individuality. Now, one could not really ask, I think, for a more explicit statement of idealism with respect to time than this, and Merleau-Ponty duly draws the requisite anti-realist conclusion. Time, therefore, is not a real process, not an actual succession that I am content to record. It arises from my relation to things. Okay, given all of this, the way in which Merleau-Ponty's position unfolds is not surprising. What turns out to be fundamental is an original upsurge, which is a kind of temporalization that provides within the lived present of the perceived world both an immediate past and an anticipated future. And that's the one, the bottom. Merleau-Ponty develops this conception in a way which is interesting. But the foundations of this temporal anti-realism are shaky. McTaggart's familiar discussion provides us with a way of thinking about what's going on here. For McTaggart, the objective B series is not real because it doesn't provide for change, whose possibility is fundamental to time. To account for change, we therefore need to switch to the A series, but the A series is contradictory, so time is unreal. Now, Merleau-Ponty clearly agrees with McTaggart about change, and he also accepts that there's a sense in which the A series is contradictory, at least if tense is thought of as absolute. But, as we have seen, he relativizes them to the subject's present experience and thus offers a way of understanding time which qualifies McTaggart's conclusion by affirming the subject dependence of time. The key move here, however, is the first step, the point where McTaggart and Merleau-Ponty are in agreement. It's not necessary now, surely, to go into detail. As Russell argued, real change in respect of properties can be understood in B-series terms as long as we have a robust conception of these properties, and change with respect to tense is readily captured by a token reflexive account of tensed thought. So a realist about time can reject Merleau-Ponty's argument. And since, as he himself maintains, he takes the point here to be of fundamental importance, to quote him again, the ideal of objective thought is both based upon and ruined by temporality. I'm afraid this conclusion ruins Merleau-Ponty's position, at least as he presents it. Okay, I'm sorry, that was a bit too long. Sorry, too long.
We started a little bit late, but nevertheless, I think we don't have more than 10 minutes discussion. Okay. Ron, yes?
Yeah. Thank you very much. Well, I'm very sympathetic with some of your critique of Merleau-Ponty, but I have the impression that you take what he says not in the sense that he would like you to take. Because
okay.
When it was evident, especially with the notion of time, and I don't think what he tried to explain is to show is the meaning of time or the subjective meaning of time, whereas what you try to criticize is not at all, I mean, the time that he referred to. So that's one thing that I would say. The second thing, it's more concrete about your examples with the phantom limb and the Schneider. Your criticism about the phantom limb, you show that Oliver Sacks, for instance, he says that it's adaptive to have a phantom limb, but Merleau-Ponty, once again, it doesn't. What he tries to show is which is not exactly objective with the phantom limb. It is the personal meaning of having a phantom limb, and he shows, for instance, that people who willingly or who accept or who have less difficulties with the accidents, they recover from, or they lose this phantom limb more quickly, for instance. So he does use some scientific findings, and he gives them meanings that someone like Oliver Sacks would not be able to give, because he wants to give objective explanation, adaptivity, and not something which is more subjective. And the second case is the Schneider case. You mentioned only the motor intentionality, but here you're missing I think that the whole point is that Merleau-Ponty is moving from every chapter. There is a section about Schneider, and he shows that what seems to be only motor actually has, for instance, sexual problem. Or Schneider cannot whistle. He doesn't sing songs. He doesn't have new friends. He doesn't have any opinion about religion, about politics. Why? Because Merleau-Ponty says he lost the ability of what he calls projection. And projection, you can say it's a kind of a mini creation. How can science use this category which is so obscure? So that's where the philosophy comes and say, yeah, there are some neurons there that are missing, and you can say these neurons are motor, but I'm trying to show you that when there is this kind of injury, it has other domains in life, and I'm trying to unify it. So I don't see how objective science can answer, or can, I mean, it's a very good example where phenomenology gives good explanations that science has difficulties to give.
Okay, there were 3 points. The first concerned time. I think I originally I started, with your view that this rather bold claim that I've attributed to Merleau-Ponty is too bold. But I regret to say that he does. I mean, the passages that I quote are completely unequivocal. There is no real time. Change is only there for the observer. Events are only discriminated from an observer's point of view. He never qualifies those.
He's a phenomenologist, he's not a scientist. So you must read him as a phenomenologist who is trying to commit a phenomenological reduction. So you cannot take this point of view and say that it's an objective or it's a scientific point of view. That's what I'm trying to say. That you should.
Yeah, but he's trying to. But in order to justify to someone who isn't already a committed phenomenologist, the thesis that phenomenology shows that the objective conception of time is misguided, you have to take temporal considerations without putting them into a phenomenological point of view. What he attempts, I mean, what he does is he has this sort of McTaggartian argument that the objectivist view is somehow contradictory or incoherent, that it can't account for change. I'm sorry, it's a bad argument. And, end of story as far as I'm concerned. Now, he has other things, interesting things to say about the phenomenology of time, about personal time. That's not a matter of dispute. But the attempt to undermine the perspective of objective natural science, which is unquestionably something that he has in his target, right from the beginning to the end of the book. I mean, there is this passage, let's go back. The ideal of objective thought is based upon and ruined by temporality. That's an unequivocal claim. I'm afraid it doesn't stand up. Let's go on now to the phantom limb case. Okay. It's no part, surely, of objective natural science to elucidate all the ways in which, the presence or the presence of a phantom limb is helpful or damaging to someone. I mean, that's like saying it's part of natural science to explain how people come to feel about an amputation. I mean, that's clearly dependent on personal circumstances. And on my understanding of natural science, it would be mad to think that all the details of an individual's personal life can somehow get put into a kind of uniform, objective natural science. That's not what natural science attempts to provide. So that's where, in a way, I guess I think there are limits to the aspirations of natural science. But the claim that Merleau-Ponty makes in that chapter is not simply that, you know, there are aspects of those who've suffered amputation and have a phantom limb which can't be captured by objective natural science. The stronger claim he makes is that the basic phenomenon itself cannot be understood properly within the framework of natural science. And that just seems to me to be false. Okay, so now Schneider. So you want to say that, in a way, I didn't do justice to the full holistic characterization of Schneider. Well, I didn't go through all of it, then that's perfectly true. But I think I'm going to make something like the same move. The basic failure that Schneider, the basic disability that Schneider suffers from is an inability to engage with what's possible. Abstract movement is part of an ability to engage with possibilities, to see the point of jokes, to imagine, and that's what underlies the incapacities that, as you rightly said, Merleau-Ponty goes on to discuss. Now, what I take to be available from within a decent objective natural science would be precisely, this may be speculative at the moment, some neurological basis for the capacity to engage with the possible. In other words, the kind of dispositions to engage in sophisticated thought, which may perhaps dependent on language, but which are clearly present in even small children. Now, then we imagine someone who loses that capacity, but they don't lose all their perceptual capacity or motor capacity. Now, then it'll depend on the idiosyncrasies of their personal life, how in particular these disabilities play out. And it won't be part of objective natural science to tell us how in particular these things get experienced in their life. But we can hope to find within natural science, it seems to me, an account of this intentional arc that Merleau-Ponty characterizes, I think, correctly.
Yes, please.
Just one comment. What I think he does throughout the book is that he's not just criticizing empiricism or the objective view of the world, but he is also at the same time criticizing what he calls intellectualism. So that his discussion moves back and forth throughout the whole book, and from in a very dialectical way. And it seems to me that this should be taken into consideration when we discuss also his, what he's saying about science and about architecture. So, for instance, a phantom limb, it is not the case that the ends of the nerves are stimulated so that you can feel a painful leg where you have now. And it's not the case that you remember or that you have suppressed memories of your lost leg. It's not the one or the other. So he is working out of a position to trying to explain the phantom limb between those positions. And this is the way he works through the whole book.
Yeah, no, of course that's right. But just two things. First, he repeatedly says, of course, that the intellectualist position is a major advance on the empiricist one. He makes no bones about it. He's much closer to this neo-Kantian position. But then he says, but it won't do. And then that's where he brings in, of course, his embodied consciousness as a kind of pre-personal, anonymous alternative. And that's an enormously original and provocative and interesting line of thought. Well, I say original, it obviously draws a great deal on Husserl. But I hope I didn't. I don't think anything I said, in a sense, contradicts that. The only difficulty one finds is that he doesn't, in the text, always flag up where he's, in a sense, voicing the intellectualist standpoint and where he's voicing his own. So there is a passage which I might have used where he says, the subject constitutes space. Boy, is that really Merleau-Ponty's view? He puts it in a passage where it looks as though he's developing his own point of view, but where on reflection it looks to me as though he's voicing the intellectualist one. Now, it's always difficult in reading Merleau-Ponty just because he doesn't actually put, so to speak, assertion signs clearly into the text to get him right. But I don't think that the passages I've relied on lack assertion, though they lack assertion signs.
I think we have run out of time. I mean, we still have another talk to come.
Yeah.
I'm sorry about that, but nevertheless, thank you very much for your interesting talk. Thank you.